The hearing will please come to order. I would like to assure the witness and Mr. Sullivan that we will finish this morning. Chairman Hamilton.
Chair recognizes Mr. Corder.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Colonel North.
Good morning, Congressman Corder.
Mr. Chairman, before I ask a question, I was the individual a few days ago that asked if Colonel North could give the briefing that he had given to so many groups before this committee, and it's my understanding that the chair's answer was yes. Late yesterday, I discovered, or at least I heard, that that briefing would be permitted, but it would not be permitted in this room. It would be permitted elsewhere in another room. And of course it bothers me because I know that this room is very well equipped technologically. And I remember the chairman's words in the beginning of this hearing when he said, "We believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant." I believe that, and I believe that if the question can be put here, the answer can be placed here as well. The chair said that the full story should be presented to the public expeditiously and fairly, and it seems to me that nothing is presented to the public if we move to a different room under different circumstances, different exposure, and a different surrounding. It was said that we must clear the air and let the facts of this unfortunate and sad affair emerge. Now, I would argue that that's true. We should let them all emerge, that what is accused in the sunlight should be able to be answered in the sunlight and not the twilight. And Mr. Hamilton said, and I agree, that these hearings will be devoted to finding out what was done during the period that the Boland Amendment was in effect to supply the Contras. By whom has it been done? At whose direction? What funds were used? And who raised them? It seems to me that the charge by Mr. Lyman, that the briefing by Colonel North was a solicitation for funds, that he asked for those funds, and it seems to me that if the charge can be made here in this room, the response can be made here in this room. I understand the briefing is not secret, it's not classified, it's not code word. It would be ironic in my mind, as well as tragic, to tell the American people that this committee, which is dedicated to presenting all the evidence, has now decided, if that in fact is the final decision, to cover up part of that evidence, to engage in a little shredding of its own. And Mr. Chairman, I know that everybody in this committee has endeavored to be bipartisan, and we have. I'm just going to mention the fact that if the decision is made by the chairs that we move to a different room for the briefing of Mr. North, that I put that question to a recorded vote. There was a statement yesterday towards the end of the day.
Let me respond.
Absolutely.
Do you want to take a vote at this time?
Not on my time. If the light goes off, I'd be happy to.
Please proceed.
Thank you. It was indicated by someone late in the day that what we should do is take a public opinion poll to determine what our foreign policy should be. And I would like to say that I disagree with that. I think indeed the opinion of the President is important, the Congress is important, and the American people is very important. But I would say that if what we did was stick our fingers in our mouths and hold it up to the political winds each time we cast a vote, sometimes those votes would be the wrong ones. I'm wondering whether the Voting Rights Act of 1964 would have been passed if that's what we did, whether the Panama Canal Treaty would have been passed if that's what we did, if important foreign aid appropriations bills would have been passed if that's what we did. What I'm suggesting here, of course, is that this Congress and this President from time to time has to assert some leadership and show as well some courage. I was talking about this to a friend of mine yesterday who sits on this panel, and he said that if Jesus Christ had taken a poll, he wouldn't have gone to Jerusalem. I was reading last night, in fact late into the evening, a book that probably everybody in this room at one time read, at least we picked up. The book is called Profiles in Courage by John Kennedy, and Kennedy wrote, "In the days ahead, only the very courageous will be able to take the hard and unpopular decisions necessary for our survival in the struggle with a powerful enemy, an enemy with leaders who need give little thought to the popularity of their cause, pay little tribute to the public opinion they themselves manipulate, and who may force without fear of retaliation at the polls their citizens to sacrifice present laughter for future glory." And I would hope and I pray and I really respect and expect that this committee and this Congress in the future will show sometimes less profile and more courage. Into an area that I would also like to get into, it's the area of leaks. Lieutenant Colonel North has indicated that one of the main reasons that he was not totally candid with the Congress is because he deeply felt that what he said to the Congress would not be kept by the Congress. It was indicated by the chair, who has, by the way, acted, both of them, in remarkable bipartisan way, and they've shown splendid leadership here, and none of my comments today should be interpreted as criticizing them. But it was indicated by the chair on the Senate side, Senator Inouye, that he had received a communication from General Odom, and General Odom said that, in fact, no leaks had come from this panel, or this joint panel. And I would like to set the record straight there if I can, and I would suggest that the full letter of General Odom be placed in the record, because I don't have time to read the whole thing, and I'd like to read just part of it. He did indicate that as follows to a letter from General Odom to the chair: "I did not say that there have been no leaks by the committees. I simply do not know whether or not this is true. I've been told that there have been some leaks on non-signal intelligence material." He ends by saying, "I do not, however, believe that you have accurately conveyed in your public references to me what I actually said about these leaks. It's my feeling and my judgment that this Congress and this committee has leaked important information." And I think, therefore, sometimes the reluctance of people like Colonel Oliver North to tell us what they know is understandable.
Because my name has been mentioned, and I'll give you extra time. This is a letter from General Odom. He says, "Dear Mr. Chairman, I want to express my gratitude for the painstaking care taken by your committee to protect the uniquely sensitive material provided to you by this agency. I particularly appreciated your staff's excellent cooperation in agreeing to view our material here at Fort Meade and not to reproduce these documents for storage elsewhere, as well as their sensitivity in handling our communication security equipment during early sessions of the hearings." Please proceed, sir.
I thank the chair. Going on, I notice also that sometimes leaks would deter the willingness of people like yourself, Lieutenant Colonel, from notifying the Congress on things, and I indicated that I was sensitive to that concern, because I believe that this body, as well as across Pennsylvania Avenue, leaks occur. But it is quite remarkable that sometimes policy changes can be affected by the mere threat of leaks. And what I'd like to do is just mention an article that was written in the New Republic by Britt Hume, and it indicated on page 20 that Biden, I think we all know who that refers to, says he twice threatened to go public with covert actions plans by the Reagan administration that were harebrained, and thereby halted them. So it's not only the leaking of classified information that causes the problem. It is obvious that we've reached the stage here where individual members of the Senate and the House of Representatives have threatened to go public, and thereby frustrating covert activities. And I'd like now to ask Lieutenant Colonel North a question, if I may. You indicated in your testimony that's now spanned 6 days and will go on to the 7th day that you were concerned about leaks It was indicated to you that no leaks had occurred here, and I would like to ask you whether you can give us any statements that would indicate to us that you were correct, that some leaks with regard to covert activities did take place in the past, and I'd like you to be as specific as you could. What I have in reference, probably you may know, has to do with the Achille Lauro affair as well as the raid on Libya. If you could address those two situations, I'd appreciate it, Colonel North.
There were revelations immediately after the Achille Lauro capture of the terrorists that very seriously compromised our intelligence activities, which allowed us to conduct the activity itself. The operation could not have been done without the availability of certain intelligence, and the statements made by a number of members of Congress thereafter seriously jeopardized that effort and compromised those intelligence gathering means. And I don't think we need to speak in further detail about that, but that is precisely the kind of thing we were talking about. In the case of the Libya raid, there was a detailed briefing provided at the White House in the old Executive Office building, which was hosted by the President. The members of the Cabinet were there that were part of the National Security Council and the National Security Planning Group. The President, several times in the course of that briefing on what we were planning to do that evening, noted the sensitivity and the fact that the lives of Americans were at risk. Nonetheless, when the briefing concluded at about 5 or 5:30, two members of Congress proceeded immediately to waiting microphones and noted that the President was going to make a heretofore unannounced address to the nation on Libya. I would tell you that the volume of fire over the Libyan capital was immense that evening. 2 American airmen died as a consequence of that anti-aircraft fire, as best we can determine. And I will also tell you that in my military experience, nobody keeps that volume of ammunition sitting around in their guns. They need a half hour, an hour to break it out, get it ready. And any one of the magazine photographs that you look at shows, or the gun camera films themselves, show an enormous volume of fire that would indicate that while we may have had tactical surprise, strategic surprise was probably sacrificed by the comments made about the fact that the President was going to address the nation that evening on the issue of Libya. If I were Muammar Gaddafi hearing those words, and there is no doubt that he did, this very session is being broadcast all over the world, as you all know. The words that I'm saying are instantly available in Moscow. The same thing happens on all of our network news. Those kinds of things alert our adversaries.
Thank you, Colonel North. Colonel North, some days ago, you were asked a question with regard to the need of presidential concern about leaks, the right of the President to withhold temporarily information from the Congress of the United States. And you had before you a decision, Curtis Wright. It was a decision of the United States Supreme Court. And what I would like to do is to give you you were asked at that particular time about it. You were about to read parts of that decision, and unfortunately were not permitted to read the parts of the decision that you wanted to. And if you have it before you today, I don't know if you do, I have a copy here, but if you do, I'd like to provide you the opportunity to read that which you did not have the opportunity a few days ago.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Senator Mitchell.
Recognized. I merely want to make one correction.
I don't believe the mic is on.
Oh, well, the note says it's on all the time. But, you mean I've been
at the wrong time it's on.
Keeping quiet all these weeks, and I didn't have to do so? I merely want to correct what I'm certain was an inadvertent statement by Representative Porter. The reference was made during my questioning. I did not ask Colonel North about the Curtis Wright case. He raised it on his own, and I then commented on it, and we didn't get into it. I'm sure the Congressman did not mean to state otherwise, and I believe the Colonel will recall that himself.
Precisely.
Right.
I thank the Senator if
Thank you, Mr.
the Colonel could proceed.
My intention was to simply read an extract from the opinion of the court and then a quote contained in that opinion from an earlier president, and it's relatively brief. He, and this refers to the president, has his confidential sources of information. He has his agents in the form of diplomatic, consular, and other officials. Secrecy and respect of information gathered by them may be highly necessary, and the premature disclosure of it productive of harmful results. Indeed, so clearly is this true that the first president refused to accede to a request to lay before the House of Representatives the instructions, correspondence, and documents relating to the negotiation of the Jay Treaty, a refusal, the wisdom of which was recognized by the House itself and has never since been doubted. In his reply to the request, President Washington said, quote, "The nature of foreign negotiations requires caution, and their success must often depend on secrecy, and even when brought to a conclusion, a full disclosure of all of the measures, demands, or eventual concessions which may have been proposed or contemplated would be extremely impolitic, for this might have a pernicious influence on future negotiations or produce immediate inconveniences, perhaps danger and mischief, in relation to other powers. The necessity of such caution and secrecy was one cogent reason for vesting the power of making treaties, etc., with the President." That is a quote from President Washington contained within the opinion of the court in U.S. versus Curtis Wright, and my purpose for trying to raise that as early as 1985 was that the President does indeed have, as has long been respected by the courts and by the Congress itself, the authority to withhold certain information from the Congress in the area of foreign policy.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see that my red light is on, and
For additional 2 minutes, sir.
I thank the chair very much. Colonel North, before you came to testify, others, of course, testified about your activities, about accounts. Traveler's checks were listed on the board to your left. And as you know, there was, or you may not know, there was a great deal of snickering and laughter about that, about snow tires, about food. You answered those questions, and I think probably everybody on the panel appreciates those answers, and I believe those answers, and I think most people on the panel do as well. Obviously, the laughter is now stopped. The jokes have now ended. People are treating your testimony with a great deal of seriousness. That is absolutely the way it should be. It was suggested a few days before you came here that you were engaged in plans to become rich. We know that's not the case now. And that you had taken money that wasn't yours. That we know that's not the case now. Albert Hakim testified, I think quite remarkably, about an incident where you were in Iran and you were given the opportunity to walk away with an $8,000 rug. Do you recall that incident?
It was in, I believe, Mainz, Germany that event occurred, but it was an Iranian who offered the rug, yes, sir.
When did that event occur and what happened there, very quickly?
My recollection is it occurred in one of the meetings during the summer or autumn of 1986. The Iranian intermediary of the second channel brought the rug with him to the meeting, a beautiful Persian carpet, and offered it to me and suggested that it was an appropriate gift from a person who cared deeply about reopening a relationship with his country. And I simply told him that that was something I couldn't do, I couldn't accept it. He offered me a handful of pistachio nuts, which are something grown a lot of in Iran, and I took them. And I ate them.
Did you eat them all?
I did, sir. And they were good nuts.
Mr. Chairman, again, I appreciate the extra time. I see that my time is up. It's pretty obvious. I think it's appropriate for me at the present time to make my motion. So, Mr. Chairman, I move that Colonel North be given the opportunity to give his presentation here as the question was raised here in this room with Americans watching. I ask for a roll call vote on that, Mr. Chairman.
I got an amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Will you state your amendment?
Let's have Spitz Channel and Rich Miller and all the rest tell us the other side of the story.
Before we...
I'd be delighted to agree with that. I'd like just 5 minutes to cross-examine each one of them.
Before we proceed, I would like to advise the panel that pursuant to your desires, we have made arrangements to have the special viewing of the slides in room S358, 385 in this building at 7:30 this evening. 485, 7:30 this evening. We have not discussed this, but since this matter has been brought up, I think it should be made public. I'm certain this morning's session will go on until about 1 o'clock. And it will take 2 hours to clear this place. Many people have thought that we've been taking long lunch hours. But some of the members of this panel are well aware why we take 2-hour lunch breaks, and that is to sweep this room. I'm certain you realize what I mean by sweeping this room. And therefore, we will resume again at 3 o'clock. We have already advised Mr. McFarland, Mr. Radzimski, that they'll be testifying. I would presume that they will go on until about 6:30. And therefore, I have scheduled it for 7:30. After we clear this place, the crews that are here now will have to clear out to move off to the House. It takes a little while. If you want to meet in this room, we can set it up for 10 o'clock this evening.
Mr. Chairman, is that a question?
Do you want to meet here at 10 o'clock this evening?
No, I see no reason why we can't have that briefing now.
Mr. Chairman?
That briefing is part of the testimony.
Mr. Chairman.
This room can be set up for that type of a briefing.
I should also point out that what is in the slides, as I indicated in my opening statement, refers to the question whether we're for or against the Contras. That is not the issue before us. That issue will be before another panel. We are here to discuss policy processes. I'm certain my distinguished friend is well aware of that. Senator Hatch.
Mr. Chairman, I don't see any reason why we can't have it right here in full purview. Testimony has been that these slides and this presentation has been shown to thousands of people. And I think it ought to be shown to the American people right here as part of this morning's thing. The slideshow, it seems to me, should be presented because it is relevant. It seems to me it's relevant to these proceedings. Much has been made here of the so-called 1-2 punch. It was a fair comment under those circumstances, but now it ought to be explained and the other side ought to be given a chance. And earlier in these proceedings, as part of a panel of 3 witnesses to give testimony that was, it seems to me, designed to make the point that Colonel North was part of a process to raise money. That same point was raised again by Mr. Lyman, and that's properly so. I'm finding no fault with that in his direct questioning of Colonel North. So I think the subject is not only relevant, it's crucial to the understanding of this, and I think it's crucial to the American people. And if Colonel North, as I would expect him to do, makes a good case for the Contras, so be it. I mean, there are lots of things that we've had to put up with in here before he ever had a chance to explain himself. And now he's had a chance, and people don't seem to, I'm not saying on the panel, but people don't seem to like that, except the American people. The American people like it. They like what they've heard in many respects. Now, I think we ought to see the presentation. We ought to see it in this room. We ought to see it this morning. He ought to be given an opportunity to express it, rightly or wrongly. There may be people who, as a result of that expression and seeing that, will disagree with Colonel North. There may be many people who agree with him. And I really don't see why there's a necessity for a vote. For the life of me, I think it's just something that needs to be done.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman
I'll be
yield?
happy to yield.
Mr. Chairman, I believe at the end of my questioning the other day, I reserved 20 minutes, and I would be happy to devote my remaining 20 minutes to Colonel North's presentation of his briefing.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. It's the only fair thing to be done. There are lots of implications here that he did something wrong in presenting the Contra side as he did in spite of the, and because of the private fundraising. Maybe that will be the final conclusion, but maybe it won't too. And the only way I'm going to know is if Colonel North has an opportunity to express himself and to show what he did and to do it basically the way he did it to thousands of people, as I recall his testimony. I think it's unfair if we don't do that, and I think it's unfair to the American people if we don't do it right here.
Senator Rudman.
Mr. Chairman, since evidently something I said several weeks ago precipitated all of this, I think it might be well to refresh everyone's recollection. I believe the senator from Utah was taking a telephone call in the anteroom at a part of my examination of the Colonel. I think Colonel has answered the question forthrightly. Let me just remind people of yesterday's testimony. I asked the Colonel, first I stipulated he had never raised money, had never asked for money, had never gone out and said, I want money. In fact, quite the contrary. In fact, Senator Hatch, you might be interested to know that I amended my 1-2 punch to say that I only thought that the one punch was necessary, judging the Colonel's fervor. Secondly, in response to a question about the Garwood incidents, the Colonel was very direct in his answer to me, and I think we all heard it. It needs no repeating. And that was not a question that had any legal significance. It was to describe broadly what happened. Now, as my friend from Utah and my friend from New Jersey know, I'm with them on voting, supporting the Contras, although many disagree with that. But quite frankly, let's face it, what's going on here is an attempt to further that cause in this hearing, and in some ways I think that would be a good idea, but in other ways, we have managed to get through to the last 2 weeks of these hearings to discuss the important policy issues. I'm sure Mr. Sullivan would like to take his client out of here. I'm sure that Mr. Sullivan has a lot of potted plants in his office he'd like to water this noon. And you know, I'm going to vote against this because I want this committee to stick to its business. The Colonel answered the question precisely. The original reason for asking him to show that was to prove that he didn't raise money. We've stipulated he didn't raise money. The Colonel, in response to my question, said, thank you, sir, and I said, that's fine. We all know the facts.
Well, the Senator
So
yields.
let's not turn this into something it isn't, or let's admit what we're doing.
Would the Senator,
Will the Senator yield?
Would the Senator yield to me?
Senator yield.
Mr. Chairman. Mr.
I
Chairman.
don't believe you wish. Do you wish to?
I'm all done.
Would the Senator yield
yield.
for just one
Chairman.
question for me, or one comment about his
Chairman.
remarks? If I could just say this, I find no fault with anything that's been done, except that for a good percentage of these hearings, we had a lot of people who were prejudging this witness based upon charts and security fences and a lot of other things, and I think he came in and explained those. The purpose of my request here, in support of the request of the distinguished congressman from New Jersey, is not to prove the battle for the Contra case. That is not the purpose. Now, if that happens, I will be very pleased. I might as well say that. Because I believe in the Contra cause. I believe in what's happening, what you believe, Lieutenant Colonel North. I believe that you were fighting for correct principles and for this hemisphere and against what really is a deleterious force and all of that. But he hasn't had a chance. Now, I agree also with Senator Rudman. He has stipulated some of the things that he has said, and I admire him for it, and I respect him for it. And he has corrected some of his statements. But there still is an impression left here that you were a loose cannon running around doing something deleterious to our country, when in fact you were telling people of what was happening, and there's an implication here that because Channel and Miller have pled guilty to what, regardless of what they pled guilty to, the fact that they pled guilty, that you may have had some connection with them. And frankly, I think that's got to be cleared up. I think it ought to be cleared up publicly. You ought to be able to give this presentation. The slides are not, are something I think the American people ought to see at this time. And I'd like to do it this morning rather than 7:30 tonight in some small room, or 10 o'clock tonight in here with nobody in attendance.
May I say something before I call a recess so that the two panels can discuss this matter separately? To have a slideshow in this room, it will necessitate the darkening of this room. TV lights are such that the slideshow cannot be seen by anyone. Therefore, the slideshow will not be seen by the people of the United States. Reason we do not wish to darken this room at this stage, unless we clear out everyone in this room, is security. And it will take at least 45 minutes to set it up. I have promised Mr. Sullivan, I've promised the Colonel that we will quit this morning. At the rate we're going, I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan, you'll have to wait until 3 o'clock to water your potted plants. But do you wish to have a vote now?
Mr. Chairman, if I may respond, I thank the Chair for recognizing me. Number one, it's my understanding that this is a request that's been around for a long period of time, and I believe what you say, but I find that those people in charge of the technological aspects of this room should be able to create a situation such that slides can be shown on television. I've had hearings for 9.5 years or 9 years as a member of the House, and many of those slide programs are picked up on TV. I just find it remarkable that for somehow it can't be done here when it's been done 9 years in a row in the House of Representatives. Number two, it's my understanding that if there is a technological problem, which I believe could have been surmounted, then Mr. Cheney has yielded 20 minutes and it can go on, irrespective of the clarity of the slide program. It seems to me that even if I fail the motion, Mr. Cheney is prepared, stands in the wings, prepared to yield 20 minutes to Colonel North for that purpose. So I would say that I'd like to have the vote. If I fail that vote, it's my understanding that Congressman Cheney will yield his time to Colonel North, and Colonel North should be given the opportunity immediately to proceed with his briefing.
Will the gentleman yield?
Mr. Chairman,
will the gentleman yield?
I would like to advise the panel that the yielding of time must be for a purpose that will be approved by the panel or by the chair.
Well, I don't know what he's going to say, so I don't know whether it's going to be.
I would still ask the gentleman to yield.
I'd be happy to yield, but
I have to get prior approval from the chair of what I'm going to say. I don't quite understand.
Senator McClure.
Mr. Chairman, may I
Will the
yield?
gentleman yield? I would ask the gentleman to yield.
If the chair will let me yield, I'll
Chair's
yield.
permission to have the gentleman yield to me.
I was advising Mr. Coulter that one may yield his time to another panel member, but the purpose of that yielding must be subject to the approval of this panel, to wit, the chairman.
I would ask the chair's permission.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like.
Senator McClure, I'm recognizing the senator. He's been waiting a long time now.
Mr.
And after
Chairman.
that, I'll recognize you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I know that it's almost impossible to separate the subject matters in this kind of a discussion or the question that the panel will now address as to whether or not to permit the time to have Colonel North make the presentation. But, Mr. Chairman, there was the implication raised at earlier stages of this proceedings that Colonel North was involved in an activity proscribed by the Boland Amendment in raising funds for the Contras. Now, that implication he didn't raise. It was not an implication raised by him in his testimony. It was an implication raised through the means of other witnesses' testimony and comments by members of this panel that indeed there was in effect a conspiracy to evade Boland by the device of having Colonel North make the pitch and someone else come in and make the solicitation. and Senator Redmond made reference to it again today, that he had described that as the old 1-2 punch. I don't think it is possible for us, under those circumstances, to deny the opportunity for this panel to see what that really was. Not for the content alone, although certainly it does have content, but because it has a fair relationship and a bearing upon the question that was raised in this committee, that somehow Colonel North's activities were erroneous under the statutes that were in effect at that time. I understand that those who are opposed to Contra aid, and I am not one of those, I'm in support of aid to the Contras, and I'm in support of what the Colonel has done. But I don't and will not vote on this matter because I'm in favor of Contra aid, but because I'm in favor of fairness to Colonel North and the others who were involved in this process.
My friend, yield for one moment.
I'd be happy.
Just so the record is clear, the description of Colonel North's activities, you can read the record, was not his slide presentations, his speeches to the ABA, which were authorized, his other speeches, which were authorized. My remarks and other remarks of this panel were directed to 2 meetings, with Mrs. Garwood at the Hay Adams Hotel, with Mrs. Garwood in Houston, Texas. The Colonel and I discussed that yesterday. I think we had a meeting of the minds on that issue. So that is not what the description was. I think we all understand that the Colonel had every right to give those speeches, those slide presentations, because he testified yesterday they were authorized by his superiors, and we know that to be true.
Well,
we are talking about 2 isolated incidents, so let's not confuse the issue.
I am not at all confused about what the issue is, Senator Redmond, although you may attempt to do that. The fact of the matter is that there were questions raised about the activity in the presentations made by Colonel North, and this presentation is essential to that, in my judgment. As I started to say a moment ago, this panel certainly has the right to make the determination as to whether or not he will be heard. He will be permitted to make that presentation, which I think is essential from his standpoint and essential from my view as to whether or not the story has been fully and fairly told. If the panel votes not to do so, I recognize that the majority rules. And I will certainly abide by the wishes of the majority as though I had any other choice.
Mr. McCollum.
But I will certainly, I do want the panel to understand why I will vote in favor of the motion that the gentleman from New Jersey has made.
Mr. McCollum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think the issue on the vote as to what time of day we have this presentation is the essence of the question of what is fair to Colonel North and what is fair in the sense of what the American public views it. We've had a lot of discussions, not in this panel so much, but in the media and amongst the public over the last few days of Colonel North's testimony about whether we've been fair to him or not. I don't impugn the motives of anyone on the committee or the leadership, but the impression is out there among many people in the public that this committee has not been fair. And it seems to me that if we're going to relegate this slide presentation to 7:30 tonight, the night of the All-Star baseball game on television, if we're going to put him in the back burner like that so that he cannot have an opportunity to give this presentation that I think all have now agreed he should be allowed to give so the American public can see it, and I agree with Congressman Corder technically whether we could shine it here with the lights in the right way for the TV media or not. They certainly can put these slides, and duplicates could quickly be made to give them. They can put them on television if they want. If we're going to shun him and his opportunity away like that, we're going to be unfair to him. And in addition to that, I have not been a party to it, and I'm sure better wisdom perhaps than mine prevail, but we are bringing forward this afternoon, presumably, or shortly after Colonel North leaves, Mr. McFarland for a period of testimony, presumably in rebuttal to what Colonel North's going to say, or has already said. And it seems to me that that also will tend to be an appearance of unfairness unless we give Colonel North an opportunity to parade back up here again and rebut whatever Mr. McFarland says. So in the context of all of this, I think it's important for the integrity of this process that we allow the presentation of these slides at a reasonable hour during the testimony of Colonel North, during the daytime, and not put it somewhere back against the All-Star game tonight or in some dark corner and some abyss where the American public will never actually see or appreciate the delivery, the style, the nature of the presentation, and always wonder about it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. DeWine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the issue is not aid to the Contras. This is being offered because really it's the best evidence of what Colonel North's intent was. It is the best evidence of what actually happened. There have been allegations, maybe not on this committee, but there have been allegations that there was something wrong with what Colonel North was doing, that he was directly involved in solicitation. The best evidence of whether he was or was not is the actual presentation itself, a presentation that he, my understanding, gave to over 100 groups. Only a few of those actually had to do with fundraising. But that's the best evidence. I would also add, Mr. Chairman, the intense interest of the American people in this presentation. I was home in Ohio for the weekend for 2 days, and I can't tell you how many people came up to me, not only expressing interest in these hearings, but who specifically said, I want to hear that presentation. I even had a call yesterday back to my office, and someone said, I want the congressman to yield his 15 minutes of time. If you can't get any other way, have DeWine yield that 15 minutes of time. So there is an interest in this, and I think I agree with Bill McCullum. We have an obligation to put this on in the normal sequence of events and not pick a time at night when the All-Star game is going on or we're going up against Jeopardy or something else. It ought to be in the normal procedure. And I think it's unfair not to have it in the normal procedure. Thank you.
Senator Cohen.
Mr. Chairman, I just have a question.
Before you proceed, I would like to advise the panel that a vote is in progress, and I believe we just have about 3 minutes to report to the Senate. So please proceed, sir.
I have a 30-second question, Mr. Chairman. Yeah. Is it the presentation or the circumstances under which the presentation was given at any particular time that's in question? If it's the presentation per se, then we should have the slideshow alone. But if it's the circumstances under which the presentation was given, it seems to me that we would have to consider calling the second punch, as Senator Rudman has talked about, and that would be under what circumstances followed the presentation, what was the relationship. So I'm perfectly prepared to have a presentation, but I think it has to be placed within the context under which it was given, if that's to present a fair picture of what took place in those given times.
Would the Senator yield for the moment?
I'm certain you recall my statement at the time this matter was brought up, that in order to provide the appropriate aura and the flavor of that moment, we would have to call in Mr. Channel and Mr. Miller. And arrangements have been made to call upon Mr. Channel and Mr. Miller and Mrs. Garwood, I believe it is, so that we will have a full picture.
Would the Senator yield on that point?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I just make this observation, that even if you bring Channel and Miller and Mrs. Garwood to make a presentation now, today, that doesn't establish for the committee what the presentation was that was made then, yesterday. In other words, the issue, if there is an issue, and I'm not sure there is because I think Senator Rudman has effectively addressed that question, but if there is an issue, the issue is the nature of the presentation that was made then. And putting together a presentation now doesn't answer that question.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rudman.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make an observation if we're talking about fairness, and I think I know how this vote might go. I don't particularly want to see Colonel North sitting here describing circumstances with Mr. Spitz Channel sitting next to him, or in the same room with him, a man who's already been indicted and pled guilty to an offense. I don't think that's fair to this witness. And so if the only way we're going to settle this thing is to have it that way, then I think we ought to think long and hard, talking about fairness, to associate the colonel with a man that's already been found guilty. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just take 30 seconds. That's fine. That is fine with me. I think it's time that we get this out publicly and just plain give the lieutenant colonel a chance to explain what he did. That's what's important. I don't care what the others did. I'll be listening with great interest what they did, but I want to know what he did. And to be honest with you, I think he ought to have that opportunity to tell the American people, and I think the technological problems can be resolved, as Mr. Corder says, and it should be done.
Mr. Chairman,
Give us time to cool our souls and to cast our vote. We'll stand in recess for 10 minutes. The hearing will please come to order. Contrary to belief held by many Americans, this panel has tried its best to be fair. On the matter before us, to wit, the showing of the slides, I have tried my best to advise one and all that because of security considerations, the lights in this room cannot be turned off. Accordingly, the slides would not be seen either by members of the panel and, more importantly, by the people of the United States. However, I believe we have worked out something that might serve the purpose intended by Mr. Coulter. We have no desire to keep any information away from the people of the United States. It was our intention to do so, and as a result, a special room had been set aside, a special screen had been acquired, a special projector was acquired. But apparently, under the arrangement, we may not see the show. Chairman Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Members will recall that Congressman Cheney had 20 minutes reserved on his time, so the chair recognizes Congressman Cheney at this time for 20 minutes for the purpose of asking questions. Congressman Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think on behalf of many of us, Mr. Corder and Senator McClure and others who spoke to this issue, we feel very, very strongly that given the line of questioning developed by counsel for the committee, it's only fair that Colonel North have the opportunity to present that information that was a part of his briefing with respect to the question of what kind of efforts he made in providing information to American citizens who ultimately cooperated in and supported fundraising efforts for the Contras. I think the key thing for us, Mr. Chairman, is that the permanent record of these proceedings show what in fact was in that presentation, and that the American people have access to that information. And I would concur in the Chairman's statement that it is impossible from a technical standpoint this morning to present the slides in this setting in a manner that would make them available to the public. So I'm going to make the following request, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I ask unanimous consent that the slides that are part of Colonel North's briefing be made a permanent part of the printed record of these proceedings.
Before responding to that, I have a question. How many slides are involved, Colonel? Because I've been told that slides are selected for different purposes.
The briefing in its current format and There were many different formats for it, of course, and we tried to update it. It has 57 slides in it, Senator.
And is there a written text that accompanies the slideshow?
No, sir.
Are there notes that you refer to?
No, I would, in the format that I gave it in many times, sometimes even up here on the Hill, I would simply put the slides up on the screen and describe the slides, and of course the contents of the entire briefing demonstrated the Soviet threat in this hemisphere and how the resistance was
Fine, sir.
responding to it.
Then we are submitting 57, is that correct, Mr. Cheney?
Yes, Mr.
Without
Chairman, that's the
objection,
request.
57 slides will be made part of the permanent record.
And secondly, Mr. Chairman, if I might, I ask unanimous consent that the material in the slides be produced in printed form and made available to the press and the public by that means.
So ordered. So ordered.
Can we have that done today? Is it possible for that to be?
We will expedite the matter, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Wyoming yield for a question.
I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Hyde.
Will there be captions on these slides? They will be meaningless if they're just reproduced as pictures, unless we know what they portray. So somebody had best compose captions for them, or as I say, I don't think they'll be too helpful.
I would be happy to ask our staff to work with Colonel North and take the slides and put them out in an appropriate fashion in 4 colors if the gentleman from Illinois so desires.
Accommodate you, sir.
Colonel North, in the time remaining to me, I would like to ask you to give us a general description of your briefing, if you will. I'm especially interested in putting on the public record as part of these hearings information about the nature and the extent of the Soviet threat in Central America and Nicaragua.
All right, sir. Perhaps the best way to do that is to simply go through the presentation as it exists, and I will try to quickly go through the slides and indicate what I would have said had the slides been up on the screen. The first slide simply demonstrates the geography and why this part of the world seems to be of so much interest to the Soviets. The first slide shows the effect of Soviet penetration in this hemisphere in the form of a consolidated communist regime in Cuba and the threat that poses to our sea lines of communication, both to Europe and through the Panama Canal, and the threat it poses to 55% of our oil supplies coming up from Latin America. The second slide is a photograph of Andrei Gromyko, then the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, and a quote from Mr. Gromyko to the effect that he said in Moscow in 1983, "The region is boiling like a cauldron. Cuba and Nicaragua are living examples for the countries in that part of the world," talking about their intentions. A second quote from Marshal Ogorkov, then the head of the Soviet Armed Forces, in Moscow when he was talking to Maurice Bishop, then the head of Grenada, in which he said, a note taken by Bishop and his people in visiting Moscow in March of '83, the Marshal said, forgive me, the Marshal said that over 2 decades ago there was only Cuba in Latin America. Today there are Nicaragua, Grenada, and a serious battle is going on in El Salvador, a 1983 pronouncement by Marshal Ogorkov. There is then a summary of Soviet policy in the region based on Soviet literature and summarized that their goal is to create such turmoil in the Caribbean basin that the United States must divert attention and military resources from areas critical to the Soviets. A follow-on slide depicts the fact that the Soviets are outspending us in our own hemisphere on a ratio of about 5-to-1. And that's in 1985's figures, 1984's figures. They have since gotten worse. A photograph showing the Soviet warships deployed in the Caribbean, what used to be referred to as an American lake, 16 miles off the coast of Louisiana, the Kiev Battle Group deployed for a refueling and replenishment exercise. A photograph of the Soviet submarines provided to Cuba, and the text that would have gone with it, would describe the fact that Adolf Hitler was able to shut down 44% of the shipping from the United States during the opening days of World War II from submarine bases based 4,000 miles away, and these submarines are based less than 200 miles away in Cuba. A photograph of a U.S. Navy F-4 escorting a Soviet Bear F strategic reconnaissance aircraft 13 miles off the coast of the Virginia Capes, and then a photograph taken by a U.S. reconnaissance platform of the Soviet military facility at San Antonio de los Baños in Cuba. It is that facility which allows the Soviets to recover their reconnaissance aircraft which fly down the east coast of the United States, and until they complete their base in Nicaragua, they are unable to do so in reconnoitering the west coast of the United States. Then a photograph of the Soviet signals intelligence site at Lourdes, Cuba, by which the Soviets, not the Cubans, but the Soviets intercept our communications, particularly our telephone and satellite communications on which we rely for almost all of our military and diplomatic correspondence via telephone and telex. A photograph showing the militarization of the Cuban children, a 6th grade class out for their firing exercises. Then a photograph showing a map showing where Cuban forces, as the mercenary army of the Soviet Union, are deployed: 3,000 in Nicaragua, 400 in the Congo, 35,000 in Angola, 700 in Mozambique, 5,000 plus in Ethiopia, and 500 in Yemen. That chart would have been updated had I still been in my current employ to show the 1,500 now in South Yemen. And the fact is that the Soviets are indeed using the Cubans as a mercenary army throughout the world. To point out that the Soviets weren't satisfied simply with having Cuba, that the militarization of the island of Grenada was first observed by U.S. reconnaissance platforms in the extension and expansion of an airfield at Point Salinas, far in excess of that required for normal commercial operations, first cued us to the fact that something was seriously wrong on the island of Grenada. And of course, in October of 1983, the next slide shows some of the Cuban economic aid going to the small island nation of Grenada, some of the packing crates from the warehouses full of weapons, stamped with Cuban Economic Office and full of munitions. The next slide shows a Chinese rocket launcher, probably made in the 1950s, probably captured in Vietnam, shipped to Grenada, and then the shipping documents for that document: weapon captured in El Salvador, the shipping documents found in Grenada, showing that Grenada was being used as a location to support Soviet designs for subversion and revolution in this hemisphere. And then a photograph of the 5 secret military agreements found in Grenada after the U.S. rescue operation. Military agreements with the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, North Korea, Cuba, and Hungary. Somehow we were unable to get those things before the American people in such a way as that they understood what was really happening in this hemisphere. It has not only happened in Cuba, it is now happening in Nicaragua. The next slide shows simply a map of Nicaragua, describing the fact that this country of about the size of Iowa or Michigan, a country with about 3 million in population, the only country in Central America with or Latin America with a decreasing population. And why that population is decreasing is because of the internal repression perpetrated on the people of Nicaragua. It shows the growth of the active duty forces in the Sandinista military machine, an enormous military buildup supported by the Soviet Union. The next series of slides shows some of the military equipment on which I've already been questioned, but it shows the T-55 tanks now numbering over 150. The PT-76 tanks and the armored personnel carriers numbering over 300. The buildup taken from reconnaissance platforms at Sandino Airfield, turned from a civilian air facility under Somoza into one of the most sophisticated military facilities in Central America. This is the armored storage area at El Tempisque, built along the Cuban model. The special airfields built by the Soviets to support and the Cubans to support the Sandinista military operations along the northern tier of that country. The construction of another armored storage area inside Nicaragua. The construction of a major port facility along the Pacific coast in order to handle the offload of Soviet military supplies being delivered along the Pacific coast at Corinto, 2 shots of that. A photograph of the Soviet and Bulgarian, Cuban construction being conducted at Punta Huete along the Atlantic coast. For the first time, the Soviets will have the ability not only to deliver, they can do it pierside, and the construction of an airstrip at El Bluf Bluefields, which the Soviets are supporting. An aerial reconnaissance platform photograph of Punta Huete, the largest airfield south of the Rio Grande, bigger than Andrews Air Force Base, which is capable of launching and receiving any aircraft in the Soviet inventory, to include the reconnaissance aircraft shown in the earlier slides, allowing them to reconnoiter the west coast of the United States, or even, if they wish, to recover backfire bombers at such a location. The next slide shows some of the supplies delivered to the Sandinistas during the period of Soviet support, which began not in 1982, but in 1979. The first of them shows one of the Mi-8 HIP helicopters. Delivered originally as agricultural support equipment, it shows some of the unique agricultural support uniforms and, of course, the party emblem next to the agricultural rocket launcher on the side of the aircraft. The next photograph is the Soviet Hind helicopter, the most sophisticated assault platform in the world today. It has been delivered by the dozens to the Sandinistas. Assembled by Soviet technicians and test flown by them, is flown by Cuban and Nicaraguan pilots against the resistance and to intimidate their neighbors. There's also a photograph of a Soviet AN-30 reconnaissance aircraft flown by Soviets in this hemisphere, not Cubans, not Nicaraguans, marked neatly with Aeroflot markings on the side, photographed surreptitiously from an aircraft landing at Sandino Airport. Some quotes from the Ortega brothers and the band of folks down in in Nicaragua, in which somehow we have been unable to explain to the American people what their real intent was in bringing about this revolution. And I think the quotes are important because it really does depict what they've been saying all along. In 1981, Humberto Ortega, the defense minister, interestingly enough, a mirror image of what is going on in Cuba. The minister of defense in Cuba is the brother of Fidel Castro. The minister of defense in Nicaragua is the brother of El Presidente, Daniel Ortega. Humberto has said, Marxism-Leninism is the scientific doctrine that guides our revolution. Our doctrine is Marxism-Leninism. And he said that in August of 1981. And what he is saying in every other word is that communism is what they want. And this was being said at a time when we somehow couldn't explain to the American people effectively that these people really were communists, and they were all along. Bayardo Arce, any investment project in our country belongs to the state. The bourgeoisie no longer exists, it subsists. 1984, the great political thinker, the Che Guevara in many respects of the current revolution in Nicaragua. Tomas Borge, the Minister of Interior, he doesn't run the national parks, he runs the secret police. You cannot be a true revolutionary in Latin America without being a Marxist-Leninist, said in Havana in 1984. And then 2 photographs of Mr. Ortega and some of his associates, one with Fidel Castro, and then with some of his other brothers in arms, in this case, the leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, shown with Tomas Borge and the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Miguel Descoto, along with Mr. Gaddafi on the deck of a Korean gunboat. There are then a series of photographs which show the attempt to subvert their neighbors. In one case, a Lada automobile I described the other day, which crashed into a bridge abutment in an automobile accident in Honduras, and then the photographs showing what was inside that automobile, to include the counterfeit money, the arms, the ammunition, the Soviet bloc radios, the code sheets, all of the things of subversion for subverting their neighbors. Then there are 2 photographs showing the arms captured after the M19 assault on the Supreme Court, in which the entire Supreme Court of Colombia was murdered, all the records of the drug running that was perpetrated and supported by the M19 guerrilla faction, all of the weapons in those photographs, originated in Nicaragua. Then a photograph that starts a series on what has happened to the people of Nicaragua. A photograph of one of the 11 new political prisons inside Nicaragua. A photograph of one of the victims with his arms and face terribly burned from having been trust-bound, thrown into his Pentecostal church and set afire while he was alive. And he managed to push himself out of the church. A photograph from a Nicaraguan school book printed in East Germany or Cuba, showing how young Nicaraguan children learned to count by counting grenades and AK-47. And of course, the textbooks talk about anti-imperialism and anti-Americanism. A photograph of some remarkable quality, showing an entire town which fled in their Sunday best across the border simply to go to church on Sunday, wearing everything that they had because they could never go back home. A series of photographs showing the dislocation of the Mosquito Indians, 25,000 to 30,000 of which have been driven from tribal homelands across the border into Costa Rica and Honduras, bringing with them their entire culture. Left alone for hundreds of years, these people no longer can go home. Then some photographs showing the Nicaraguan resistance. It shows the young men and women who have taken up arms because they've been denied any other recourse in their own country. It shows the 57-year-old coffee farmer who I described earlier, who came home and found his entire family murdered by the Sandinistas because they gave water to a passing Contra patrol. A series of photographs showing how the resistance looks as a consequence of the assistance I am accused and admit to having delivered. A photograph showing the leadership of the FDN. And in that photograph of 16 men, 11 of them are former Sandinistas. A photograph of a resistance unit crossing into Nicaragua. Another one of a patrol deep inside Nicaragua. A photograph of a wounded resistance soldier who benefited from the support that we provided during the cutoff, and then a photograph of what it looked like before that help arrived. A photograph of the emergency aid station and intensive care unit, which is nothing more than a field tent without even mosquito netting. A photograph of the plastic maps that they were forced to draw their own battle plans and patrol routes on because we couldn't even give them that. And then finally a photograph showing the grave of a resistance fighter. And the conclusion of the briefing is, gentlemen, that we've got to offer them something more than the chance to die for their own country and the freedoms that we believe in. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Colonel North. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Senator McClure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Colonel North. And Mr. Chairman, before commencing my questioning, thank you for the accommodation that was reached in order to allow Colonel North to make the presentation that he has. And I think without asking the committee to enter into the stipulation which Senator Rudman offered earlier on behalf of himself, he stipulated that indeed this presentation, followed as it was in other settings by contacts of other people, did not in and of itself constitute a solicitation of funds. And I think Senator Rudman's words were that he would stipulate that those activities were not, that you did not and you had not been involved in raising funds in these activities. I say that because I realize that every member of the two committees that are here will make their own judgments about that fact, and so will the American public. But I do want to at least follow Senator Rudman's suggestion to the extent that I can by my remarks, indicate that I too think the record is very, very clear that you were very, very careful that you did not personally solicit money.
That is correct, sir.
You've testified to that, and while some say, well, you went right up to the line, that indicates you tried to get over it, while others are saying you went up to the line and you carefully followed the law that was in effect at that time.
I did, sir.
Colonel North, I want to go back in just a few minutes and kind of reconstruct where we are on the basis of your testimony and what it is these committees are really about. Our charge is to find out, indeed, what was U.S. policy in Iran? What was U.S. policy as reflected by the evolution of our policy with respect to Iran, and what does that mean with respect to the evolution of that policy? What were the influences? How did it come about? What were we really about? And secondly, the point that we began in these hearings, what was this Contra network and how did the two get mixed together? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do want to get the background laid very quickly, and I will ask you if indeed you agree or disagree with my summary, and I hope indeed if you disagree you'll state it briefly, and if you agree, just state that. If I understand your testimony to this point, the United States was approached by representatives first from Israel and then from Iran, suggesting that we open a dialogue with elements inside Iran looking towards the time when there would be a different regime and a different relationship between the United States and that new regime in Iran. Am I correct?
Yes, and to assist in furthering that change of regime.
And I would submit from my own standpoint that any administration that was given any hint of that was possible and did not pursue that opportunity would be derelict. Not because we like Khomeini, because obviously we're not seeking to deal with Khomeini. We're seeking to find a way to deal with a different government in Iran than the one that exists there now, recognizing the importance of that country geostrategically and also economically because of the importance of oil to the world's economy. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
That from that initiative, the representatives of this country and of Israel began exploring ways in which that might be accomplished. And in that process, we ran into some rather strange bedfellows. People like Mr. Ghorbanifar, who made suggestions in spite of the fact that we didn't really have any reason to trust him, but nevertheless he made suggestions about the means by which we could accomplish the end of making contact with those elements in Iran. And among those suggestions was, you've got to prove you're really serious. Who is this guy, Colonel North, or whoever else the representatives might have been of the United States? Were you really speaking for the President of the United States? Show you're serious. Show you really speak for the United States, and that gave birth to the notion of proving bona fides by supplying arms. Is that correct?
That is my understanding of how it initiated, because I was not there at the conception, if you will.
Colonel North, this isn't a summary because you haven't yet testified to this fact, but isn't it a fact that Israel was already involved in arms trades with with Iran, involving not only arms which they produced themselves inside Israel, but also arms which had been supplied by the United States to Israel?
Apparently so, yes, sir.
So that this was not an unprecedented or new idea so far as the relationships between Israel and Iran were concerned.
We do not believe it was.
That following that time, it was suggested, and I think again suggested to us by representatives of Israel, that Iran could prove their bona fides with us by putting pressure upon the Lebanese captors of U.S. hostages, to put pressure upon them to release hostages as an evidence of the fact that they indeed had clout within their own government.
Yes.
And that led to what has been described as the arms for hostages transactions.
That's correct.
Rightly or wrongly, that's the way it evolved.
It did.
It was also suggested to us that if you really want to get any kind of a new relationship with Iran, you got to solve the question of hostages first, because no responsible American government can deal with a government in Iran so long as Iran has the key, or can put pressure upon those who do have the key, that locks up our hostages.
Exactly.
So it wasn't hostage generated from the beginning, but hostages were both a means of proving bona fides and also as removing a roadblock to the evolution of that kind of a new relationship with a new element inside Iran.
Correct.
Following that, then, came the escalating demands and the difficulties that came along with those escalating demands in the arms transactions with Iran and the pressures that would result in the release of hostages. And there were a whole series of those difficulties.
Certainly were, sir.
No, I've been intrigued, and I asked earlier what witnesses about this. I've been intrigued by the fact that Israel, who is so competent in so many ways, screwed up that arms transaction so badly.
The November one.
Yes. And they had had successful arms transactions for a long while. But suddenly, in November, at about the time the United States was about to withdraw from the whole initiative, they suddenly have a stranded arms shipment stranded in Portugal because they didn't have the right kind of clearances, because they're trying to fly shipments in aircraft with Israeli markings, whole host of different kinds of problems, all of which should have been very familiar to them. Is that correct?
Yes, and I have tried not to hypothesize, although many have, as to why that happened.
Well, did it cross your mind at the time that that's odd, that this group of people who are so very, very competent in so many different ways and have carried on this arms trade for a period of years, suddenly finds themselves in grave difficulty on a shipment and have to ask us for help at the very time that we're about to withdraw from the entire initiative?
It did, sir.
But nevertheless, we did, at some time about then, begin to have further overtures from Israeli agents, and I think you've testified that Ghorbanifar was an Israeli agent.
At least that's how he was seen by our intelligence services.
So you believed at the time the contacts that he was an Israeli agent?
I believe then, and I believe now.
That indeed, they wished this to go forward, and they were trying to find a way to persuade us to go forward.
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, you had meetings with Mr. Neer, I believe, at the end of December or early January, and nothing was said about the diversion of the funds or the use of the funds derived from arms sales with respect to Contras. He was talking about the use of proceeds for other covert activities.
That is correct.
And the U.S. government at that time, both yourself and others, were still saying no.
That's correct.
I think Mr. McFarland had made a trip to London, and he came away and said, it's done, it's finished, this is a bad deal, let's don't go any further with that. That had occurred before your meeting with Mr. Neer.
I don't recall the meeting quite as emphatically as that, but certainly Mr. McFarland expressed reservations about continuing on if all that we could get was Mr. Ghorbanifar as an intermediary.
And that went on through December and into January, and then sometime later you had this meeting that you've referred to somewhere in Europe probably, with Mr. Ghorbanifar in the bathroom when he suggested to you, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea to use the Ayatollah's money to support the Contras?
That's correct, sir.
And that struck a spark with you.
It did indeed.
He found the right sales pitch.
1-2 punch.
Yeah. With one guy.
Yes, sir.
But nevertheless, that was the genesis of the connection between Iran and the Contras.
Yes, sir, it was.
In spite of the fact that some people will point to an earlier time when you had called upon General Secord and Lake Resources to help expedite the shipment in December.
And that was the sole purpose on calling upon him back in November.
In November.
Yes, sir.
But it had nothing to do with a Iran-Contra connection at that time.
It did not.
One of the things that I can't help but turn over in my own mind, that the United States policy was and is a neutrality, if that's the right word, between our policy towards Iran and our policy towards Iraq.
That was our publicly stated policy, but members of the Intelligence Committee already know that we were not entirely neutral in that activity.
And that stated policy was not the same as Israel's stated policy.
No, it was not.
Part of our stated policy was also to bring about an end to the war.
It is, and it was and is.
And that's not Israel's stated policy.
I'm not entirely sure, Senator, that I could clearly state what their public policy is, but clearly they were not as interested in ending the war as we were.
Matter of fact, from an Israeli standpoint, the continuation of the war that keeps Iraq occupied
is to their benefit.
Is to their benefit.
That's correct.
And Iraq is a greater threat to them than Iran, simply because Iraq has been involved in armed conflict with Israel in the past.
Precisely.
And is close to their borders.
Yes, sir.
And has the largest active tank force in the Middle East.
That's correct.
And if there's one thing that the Israelis have to be concerned about, it's not air superiority, it is ground warfare.
Yes,
and
sir.
Ground warfare in the use of armored vehicles. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
I think the war between Iran and Iraq indicates that just masses of manpower, as Iran has used, are not necessarily going to dominate a war in which the other side has adequate armor.
That's correct.
And so Israel's concern with Iraq has to be based upon their willingness to use arms against Israel, their past history of doing so, their current capability of doing so, if the war between Iran and Iraq were to end.
Yes, sir.
And it is also a fact, is it not, that the one weapon that the Israelis urged us to provide to Iran was the TOW.
Well, they were also engaged with the Hawks.
But the Hawks was as a result of the request by the Iranians.
As best we can determine, yes, sir.
And the TOWs were the suggestion that we received from Israel.
Yes, sir, it was.
And TOWs are an anti-tank weapon.
And a darn good one.
And that would also coincide extremely well with the concerns that Israel has with the Iraqi armor.
Yes, sir.
So that if we could provide Iran with enough TOW weapons to destroy Iraqi tanks, that's perfectly consistent with Israeli policy and Israeli concerns.
Yes, sir.
From the standpoint of the success or failure of a policy, the failure of this policy would be extremely damaging to the United States. You discussed that. If the cover got blown and the public began to discuss what it was we were trying to do in Iran, that would be damaging.
Yes, sir.
I
believe it has been.
If the cover got blown and we were talking about the connection between this and Contra policy, it'd be extremely damaging.
Yes, sir.
As is proven to be the case. But you discussed that. And you recognized there was a tremendous downside, a tremendous risk in failure.
Yes, sir.
But despite that, the opportunities for success or the opportunities to move U.S. interests forward on those several different fronts outweighed the hazards of failure in your mind or in the mind of those who are making policy.
Yes, sir.
Now, to the Israelis, a failure of this policy would not be nearly so damaging, would it?
Does not appear to have been.
Well, wouldn't that be apparent at that time?
Yes.
We'll try it. If it works, fine. If it fails, well, so what? More or less, the risks of failure on the Israeli scale of cost-benefit was far less important to them than it was apparent it would be to us.
I could agree with that.
I go through that not because I have any disrespect for the Israelis at all, but I do wonder why it was that U.S. policymakers walked in step with Israeli policy and didn't respond to what were apparent inducements being offered by them at a time when the risks to them were much less than the risks to us.
Well, you're asking me a question that I think we all weighed, and we simply estimated that the long-term benefit to us was worth the risk. The necessities were great, and having weighed all of those, we decided to proceed.
Well, I see my time is about expired, and I don't have time to detail all of the contacts that were made by various people from Israel to the United States. Mr. Schwimmer, whom has been identified a number of times. I understand a man with dual citizenship, a citizen of the United States as well as a citizen of Israel.
I was unaware of that till this time, sir.
He's also been in the past a registered foreign agent for the Israeli government, although he's sometimes portrayed as being nothing but an arms merchant, a private citizen in Israel. Mr. Ladine is a U.S. citizen But he shows in the early contacts and in the persuasions that were attempted to keep us involved in this process. Is that not correct?
Again, I think, as I testified, Mr. Ledeen was indeed interested in the long-term benefit to the United States by pursuing this.
Mr. Chairman, I'll not abuse your time, but I want to just close with this much statement on another subject, because I don't want to overemphasize it, but I do want to state it. I agree with Senator Cohen that we should not overstate the magnitude of security leaks, that there are an awful lot of contact between the administration and the Congress in which security is maintained. Sensitive, important, with lives at risk, kinds of operations in which the Congress has fully shared information and continues to fully share information with no damage to the security of the people that are involved or of the policy itself. But having said that, I think it is equally important that we not overlook the impact of the apparent insecurity on the part of the Congress with respect to the administration deciding to withhold information from the Congress in a matter of this kind. And I'm not going to go through a listing of all of the security leaks that have occurred and the impact that they have had upon the security of the United States, but I would like to just at least call attention for those who want a broader look at it to an article which appeared in Reader's Digest entitled "Congress is Crippling the CIA" by Roland Evans and Robert Novak in the November issue of the Reader's Digest. Now, I can't tell you whether that article is accurate or inaccurate. I will not either agree with all of the statements that are made or disagree, but there's been a lot of comment. There have been comments during the process of this hearing, any number of news reports that attribute information to members of the Congress and to members of this committee. And it's suggested that it's wrong for us to suggest that there is a danger in selective leaking of information. There is, whether it's done by the Congress or whether it's done downtown. And it's done at both ends of the street.
I agree.
By people who seek to gain an advantage in the public dialogue over questioned, not questionable, questioned public policies. And so people do indulge themselves in various kinds of comments, of leaks, of speculation. And I rather suspect, without knowing it, but I rather suspect that some of those unattributed sources are simply a cover by a journalist who desires to write a story and give it credibility by saying they have a source when indeed they don't have one at all. And that makes it look like the leaks are greater than they really are. And finally, as to whether it's wrong to withhold information from the American public, I wonder how many journalists are willing to tell us what their sources are. Mr. Chairman, finally, if you were held captive, if you were suddenly picked up as a hostage, and they were to indulge you in that good old American custom of one phone call, would you call the Congress or the FBI or Colonel North? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cohen, do you seek recognition?
One question, Mr. Chairman. Senator McClure raised the issue, and I'd like to direct this to Colonel North if I could. Senator McClure raised the issue as to whether or not the Israelis intentionally aborted the transfer of Hawk spare parts in November of 1985 in order to draw the United States into an Iranian web. And I'd like to ask you, Colonel North, is there any information that the committee or the intelligence committees in the House and the Senate have not received that would indicate that at that time, in November of 1985, we were actually considering pulling out of this relationship that we had established with the Israelis in August of 1985? I am not aware of a single shred of evidence that that was the case.
No, and I want to make sure that I responded correctly to Senator McClure. There were always misgivings, as you have seen in the documents that I sent forward to my superiors about proceeding with the initiative. The question I thought I was responding to was, had we considered how badly and why the November initiative was so badly fouled up? And I have indeed asked myself that a number of times. The conclusion I came to at the time and that furthered us in the January findings was the fact that there was extraordinary incompetence on the part of those engaged. First of all, in the offering of something that the Iranians really didn't want, and second of all, in the procedures they used to make the deliveries. Why it was that that happened, I think, can possibly be explained by the people engaged in it. But there were always misgivings throughout all of this, and I think the documents I sent forward showed that.
But we had no intention of withdrawing from that plan and working with the Israelis at that time in November. The discontent, as the records will reflect before the intelligence committees, did not really set in until we started, Bud McFarland went to meet with Mr. Ghorbrani. We knew the Secretary of State was opposed to the transaction to begin with, but I'm not aware of any evidence that we were contemplating withdrawing this relationship with the Israelis in November of 1985, and I think the implication that this may have been an Israeli plot to draw us into this spider's web, I think, is not correct.
Mr. Chairman, if I might respond, since it was with respect to the question that I had asked, I don't think I indicated or intended to indicate that we were attempting to withdraw from a relationship with Israel. I think what I intended to imply and to state, and I think there is evidence that supports it, is that we had about given up on the initiative with respect to Iran.
I'm not entirely sure of that, Senator McClure, and again, my operational involvement began in November, and I cannot speak with certainty about how Mr. McFarland or those that had approved the August, September, and then the November shipment actually felt about it at the time, and I don't mean to mischaracterize how they felt about it, because my sense is there were misgivings, there was concern about proceeding, but that they didn't necessarily feel like, well, this is the last chance coming up to November.
Chairman Hamilton.
Mr. Stokes is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel North, for the past several days, I've heard statements that suggest to me that there's confusion about why these hearings are being held, and specifically why you are here. On the day that the House adopted the resolution creating the House Committee, January 7th, 1987, this matter was very intelligently and articulately addressed in a speech on the floor by Congressman Dick Cheney, the ranking minority member of the House Committee. I want to read a couple of excerpts from his speech on the floor. Firstly, he said, and I quote him, "I would like to remind my colleagues, especially on this side of the aisle, that we are not here today because of a plot by anyone in the Congress to create problems for the administration or for our party. No one in the Congress decided to sell arms to Iran. No one in the Congress decided to enter into negotiations with the release of hostages. No one in the Congress was involved, to the best of our knowledge, in the alleged diversion of funds to the Contras. We're here today because problems developed in the administration." He then went on to say the President is the one who removed 2 senior officials from the NSF staff, called for the appointment of a special prosecutor, and urged us to create select committees to deal with this matter on Capitol Hill. Then I quote him again, where referring to the committee being created, Mr. Cheney said this, "To give it a mandate so that it can, in fact, do what our President said that he wanted to have done, which is to get to the bottom of the matter as quickly as possible, to thoroughly investigate the allegations that have been made, and to produce for the American people a report, and for this Congress, that will let us make judgments, decisions, and determinations about whether any additional action is required with respect to legislation governing the conduct of U.S. foreign policy or covert operations. He closed by saying it is a very important charter, close quotes. I agree with Mr. Cheney. That is a very important charter that brings you here today. With that introduction, I'd like to begin my questions. Colonel, you have on several occasions made reference to the term plausible deniability with reference to covert operations. I really do not want anyone to think that that concept, as you describe it, has any real validity today. In fact, yesterday afternoon you used the term in these hearings, plausible deniability. We did away with this concept that you refer to after the Church and the Pike Committee investigations in the mid-1970s. That's why we have a statute that requires findings. That's why we require that authority from the President be in writing. That is why we require that professionals conduct covert operations. That is why Congress is informed. There is no plausible denial as far as the President is concerned. The establishment of permanent intelligence committee, oversight committees in the Congress means there is no plausible denial to Congress. What we seek to do in covert operations is to mask the role of the United States from other countries, not from our own government. Let's examine the operations that you conducted. Mr. Ghorbanifar and his associates were aware. The Israelis were aware. Mr. Khashoggi, Mr. Furmark were aware. International arms dealers knew. The Iranians knew. When you went to Tehran in May, all the Iranians knew your identity and that of Mr. McFarland. When you brought the second channel to the United States, you gave them a midnight tour of the White House. You even had President Reagan inscribe a Bible for presentation to the Iranians. So there was no plausible denial as far as these outsiders were concerned. Our sworn enemies knew. And eventually, I believe, they exposed our covert arms sales. So my question is, didn't anyone involved in this operation ever say that all of our cutouts and secrecy won't work? That plausible denial couldn't protect us? That it would be those who did know who eventually would betray us?
Congressman Stokes, I would beg to differ. I think in the case of the assistance to the Nicaraguan Democratic Resistance, which began in 1984 and continued on until my tenure was completed at the NSC, we did conduct an activity of plausible deniability. Charges can be made and they don't have to be confirmed. And indeed it succeeded. The local governments that were providing assistance, the agents who operated inside Nicaragua, the Europeans who assisted us, are still indeed, in many cases, protected. To a certain extent, that is part of plausible deniability. The fact that there was a person who was prepared at the time to accept the responsibility and be discharged to provide the kind of international and domestic political protection for the President, had there not been criminal charges, could well have proceeded. And my answer to you is that I think that plausible deniability is still a factor, whether we're talking about plausible deniability for the President or the executive branch or the whole involvement of the government of the United States, is still an issue that needs to be considered in any of these activities. So I guess what I'm saying to you is, yes, there were always foreigners who were aware. There are foreigners who are aware in almost every one of our covert operations undertaken that are approved by your committee. I mean, when your committee approves a covert action finding signed by the President, the expectation is that the role of the government of the United States is not to be revealed.
That's correct.
And thus that is part of, not just
another country, not
I beg
the
to
United
differ,
States.
sir. We almost invariably rely upon the assistance of foreign governments, foreign personnel to carry out those activities. And you and I know that. We have briefed those activities to the committees. And what I'm saying to you is the expectation is that they will not indeed be revealed, and the role and activities of the United States will not be revealed. And that is indeed part of plausible deniability.
But Colonel, the only thing I'm saying in terms of your plausible deniability here, the only persons to whom you were denying plausibility were Americans. All the foreigners knew who you were.
But they didn't. Congressman Stokes said is precisely my point. The Sandinistas, and this goes to the heart of one of the other questions earlier and to the slide showing Lourdes, Cuba. Director Casey was confident that the information about my role and the telephone calls being made back and forth to my telephone in the White House or at the old Executive Office building were intercepted at Lourdes, Cuba. And the two reporters specifically were provided with that information, and they used that information to start a whole plethora of articles about my activities, which indeed compromised the operation, but because it was never confirmed, the Sandinistas never succeeded in shutting down the supply line to the resistance. The same thing obtains in the case of the Iranian operation. Yes, there were foreigners involved, but all Iranians didn't know, or there would have been another revolution in Iran. All Europeans didn't know, the Israelis knew, and certain Israelis knew. And that is, after all, the essence of the operation. It wasn't done as a means of simply keeping it from the Congress. The effort was made to conceal the operation, and I have testified here for 6 days on why I did what I did, and I think the record is very clear on that. I'm not asking you to necessarily agree with it. I'm simply giving you the facts as I knew them at the time, and you can make your judgments on them. But plausible deniability was a factor in what I did and what I was approved to do.
Colonel, in another area, on March 6, 1985, an arms depot in Managua, Nicaragua was destroyed by an explosion. What was your role in arranging for the explosion?
To conduct any specific operation, certainly not by me. Mr. Walker was engaged to provide operational support for certain activities in the region, as I understand it. And I do not know the contractual relationship he had with anyone in those activities.
Who paid Mr. Walker for conducting that operation?
It is my understanding, and I do not want to speak with absolute definity on it. You have seen the documents that I provided to the committee, or that were provided to the committee from my files. It is my understanding that he was paid by the Nicaraguan resistance or by General Secord.
Did you have to arrange any type of approval in conjunction with his work there?
I am quite certain that I sought the approval of my superiors. I don't recall the specific event, but when Mr. Walker's advice and counsel was sought on those kinds of activities, I'm sure that I informed my superiors.
And by your superiors, to whom do you refer?
I'm talking specifically of, and I do not recall when Mr. Walker was first engaged to provide assistance. If it was 1984, it would have been Mr. McFarland, and if it was 1985, it would have been Admiral Poindexter. I would simply have advised him that he was being brought in as the person to provide that kind of assistance.
Did you seek approval?
When I say he, I'm not so much referring to he personally as his organization, people that he would hire, etc.
Did you seek approval beyond either Mr. McFarland or Mr. Poindexter?
No, as I have testified throughout. Those were the people to whom I reported. I'm sure that I gave indication to Director Casey that this had been done. Other than that, no different than I have testified, sir.
Was there any discussion with your superiors about the possibility that this action might violate the Boland Amendment?
No, I don't recall any such discussion. And furthermore, I don't recall any specific planning on my part for that specific activity prior to its, the event.
Colonel, your full-service covert operation sounds to me a great deal like what is known as the CIA's Reserve for Contingencies Fund. You're aware of that fund, aren't you?
I am, sir.
And you know that that's a fund that we appropriate. It's authorized under the Intelligence Committee of the House and the Senate. And it's a fund where the President can spend from that fund and not have to account to the Congress for his expenditures. Is that correct?
I am not quite certain of the last part of it. I believe that those funds all have to be identified. My understanding, Mr. Chairman, was that when the agency expended those funds, they had to then, and they have to today, report to your committee and to Senator Boland's committee how those funds are being expended. That was my understanding anyway.
Yes, but they don't have to come to us to seek approval of it. That's what I'm saying. Once we appropriate that funding for them.
But it was also my understanding that in the case of the Boland proscriptions, going all the way back to 1984, when we sought the release of reserve funds to continue support during the summer of '84, that release was forbidden.
All right, let me tell you what I think the difference is between the CIA